Welcome and thanks for joining us. I'm Amy Malventano, and today we are going to have a workshop session that is devoted to graduate students and their research work that they're doing in the department. For our workshop today, we have put together a panel of 4 graduate students who will be sharing their current research, all of which is tied into their dissertation projects or their thesis projects. First, we have 3 PhD candidates. We have Steffi Greenhill. Steffi focuses on the Civil War, and her research looks at refugees who fled from the Confederacy during the Civil War. Today, she will be presenting the introduction from her dissertation, which is entitled The Civil War as a Migratory Event. And then we have Mel Capitan. Mel's research focuses on monasticism in the early medieval West. Mel's research talk today will be entitled Seeing Sound, the Early Medieval Pastoral Code as the Visual Gateway. And then we have Julian McCommons. Julian studies the social history of Black Appalachians in the 20th century. Today, she will be sharing the second chapter of her dissertation entitled Campus to Community, the First 2 Years of the Black Appalachian Commission, 1969 to 1971. And then finally, we have Abby Stevens, who is a graduate student working towards her master's. And today she will be sharing the second chapter from her thesis entitled Building Public Health in the Rural State, Kentucky's Fight to Prevent Disease, 1883 to 1914. And today's discussant for today's panel is the Department's Director of Graduate Studies, Dr. Amy Taylor. Besides being a professor of American history and our graduate student director of graduate studies, she is also currently holds the title of the T. Marshall Hahn Professorship. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Taylor.
All right. Well, thank you, Amy. Can you all hear me okay? Because I'm not sure. Okay, good. I'm not going to say too much, especially to start off, because well, some of you already got a sneak peek of a couple of our presentations today, and I did as well. And we have a wonderful cross section of the research that's going on in our department that's going to be presented today. So I'm just going to immediately turn it over to the 4 panelists. And then at the end, I'm going to weigh in with about 5 minutes or so of comments, and then we'll get a discussion going. But we're going to move chronologically in time. So we're going to begin very early with Mel Capitan, and I'll just turn it over to Mel.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. It should pull up my PowerPoint presentation. Can someone confirm? Sorry, I can't see you all anymore.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. All right. So before I get started, I just want to thank everyone for being here. And I also want to thank Dr. Makros and Amy Malventano for organizing the history workshop series and inviting me to participate. And also, of course, Dr. Taylor, who is the moderator or discussant for today. All right. During the late 8th and 9th centuries in the Frankish kingdoms, there was a flurry of exposition on the regulations and purpose of monastic life, including new commentaries on the monastic liturgy of the hours and on the rule of Benedict. This flourishing period of writing was part of a larger trend often referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance, a term, though, that has received significant reconsideration by specialists in recent decades. Spanning roughly 150 years from the reign of Pepin the Short, who died in 768, through Charlemagne, who died in 814, and to Charles the Bald, who died in 877, this period witnessed an increase in book production, new writings on monastic life and liturgy, and an expansive network of scholars connecting royal court to individual monasteries and bishoprics. This serves as the background to my dissertation, which discusses daily life in the early medieval monastery through the lens of sensory history, to show that regulation of the soundscape was an essential element of ascetic life for the making of community and the spiritual progress of an individual monk or nun. The daily rhythms of the early medieval monastery were organized around three principal activities: prayer, manual labor, and reading. In what follows, I hope to introduce very briefly one example I use to discuss the role of reading in providing theological models for monks and nuns about the sonic meanings of prayer. Early in my dissertation research, I began to work with Psalter manuscripts, which fascinated me for two reasons. The first was that the Book of Psalms formed the words of the music of the monastic liturgy. Rules for monastic communities shared a vision that monks and nuns would chant all 150 psalms at least once a week. Under the rule of Benedict, the psalms were distributed across the week, assigned at least once for each of the 8 daily hours or set times of prayer. I was curious about what the pages conveyed about how medieval monks and nuns considered their music making, and how they learned the words that they intoned every day of every week for entire lives. The second reason I was drawn to the Psalter manuscripts was because these codices contained significantly more material than the Book of Psalms alone. Psalter manuscripts transmitted an extensive paratextual apparatus containing commentaries on the Psalms, as well as other liturgical materials. My research has focused most extensively on the exegetical prefaces to the Psalms, which offered historical, Christological, and moral interpretations of the Book of Psalms. These short interpretive passages provided monastic readers with accessible theological readings of the sounds of the liturgy. Effective psalmody engaged the mind as well as the lips, a commandment found within the text of the Psalms themselves. Psalm 46:8 enjoins performers to, quote, sing the Psalms with understanding. In the words of liturgical scholar Joseph Dyer, this activation of the mind during the oral performance of the liturgy meant that in the medieval office, the singing of psalms was far more than a musical exercise. Years of daily encounters with the prayers of the psalmist fostered a rich contextuality of associations, a private interior exegesis of the scriptural text, and an ever-widening field of significance. For my research, Psalter manuscripts provide access to some of those private acts of interior exegesis, particularly for understanding the theological value attached to the sonic aspects of the liturgy. One of the many things I noticed among the Psalter prefaces was how they played with an ambiguous reading of the Latin word psalterium in their historical and Christological interpretations of the Book of Psalms. The Latin word psalterium can be translated as both Psalter codex and the musical instrument known as a psaltery, a type of harp that Christian texts, including numerous Psalter prefaces, associated with the ancient Israelite King David. The Psalter prefaces and accompanying illustrations use the dual meanings of psalterium to signify that the reader of the physical codex was indistinguishable from the performer of psalmody. The chanting of psalms in the medieval monastery was a strictly vocal performance, unaccompanied by instrumentation. Medieval authors, such as the 6th century writer Cassiodorus, considered this to be a shift from the practices of the ancient Jewish temple, which the Psalms themselves attest to having been conducted with harps, horns, and drums. Cassiodorus understood the different worship practices between the ancient Israelites and his own contemporary monastic singers as a symbol of the transition from the covenant of the Old Testament to the new, following Christ's incarnation and resurrection. In his commentary on the Psalms, he wrote, "When hymned by men's voices, the Psalms rival the pleasant-sounding instrument. When loudly shouted, they echo trumpet sounds. And by the mingling of living chords, they produce the sound of the harp. The notes previously observed as issuing from musical instruments are now seen to emanate from the rational bodies of men." In other words, the human voice can evoke the same sonic qualities as trumpet and harp, yet does so through a rational living being. The living chords of the human throat represent the heavenly things of the new covenant with Christ. The prefaces and illustrations found in Psalter codices make use of this ambiguous reading of Psalterium to blur the lines between codex and musical instrument. One example is found in a Psalter now held in the Bibliothèque Municipale of Angers, France. Current scholarship suggests that it was produced at the Abbey of Saint-Remy-des-Sons between 830 and 850. It's an extraordinary manuscript transmitting nearly every element of the Psalter apparatus, often in unique ways. One example is found in the 2-page spread seen here, showing illustrations of musical instruments mentioned in the Book of Psalms with accompanying descriptions. On this folio, we find 2 separate illustrations of the Psaltery. The top one matches a description given by Cassiodorus of the Psalter, of the Psaltery, as an instrument with a tuneful hollow in the shape of the letter delta, with a fat belly in its upper part. When the strings are taut and plucked with the plectrum at that place in the manner prescribed, they are said to give forth the sweetest melody. The belly refers to the hollow sounding box within which the notes from the plucked strings resonate. The Psaltery seen here matches this description. It is shaped roughly like the Greek letter delta, and the small blue triangle near the small blue rectangle, near the top seems to indicate the opening of a resonance chamber. Cassiodorus goes on to say that this construction, with sounding box on top, makes the Psalterium distinct from other stringed instruments which have their resonance chamber at the base of the instrument. The second illustration on folio 13 recto makes the same claims, that the Psalterium is distinct from other harps due to the manner by which it produces sound. You can see here an image of King David holding a rectangular shaped instrument. According to the Latin text, the strings of the Psaltery are organized so that when the instrument is held, the lowest note is closest to the player, with the highest note furthest away, meaning that through the proof of the moving hand from the lowest note to the highest, the strings signify Christ's resurrection from hell up to the kingdom of heaven. The figure of David is seen plucking those strings in the image, invoking the upward climb of both pitch and ascent into heaven. In both of these descriptions, the manner of sound production from the Psaltery is understood as a sign that this particular instrument, which shares the name of the Psalter Codex, is distinct from other forms of music making. The monk or nun who held the Angers Psalter between their palms would be invited to consider the musical function of Psalterium, blending the visual process of reading the Codex and their own sonic engagement with the Psalms in the daily rhythms of the divine office. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mel. And we're just going to head right forward in time to the 19th century United States, and Steffi Greenhill will be our next presenter.
All right, so moving forward 1,000 or so years, I'm going to start with a very brief history of the Freedmen's Bureau, and I hope you'll see how this leads into my topic and into my dissertation. So the Freedmen's Bureau, or what is more formally known as the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Land, was initially conceived of in 1863 as the Bureau of Emancipation. And this was intended as a temporary support system for displaced and destitute freed people. And over time, this Bureau of Emancipation evolved into a Department of Freedmen's Affairs. After about 2 years, this Department of Freedmen's Affairs was still under heavy debate. It had become, by 1865, a proposed bill for a Department of Freedmen and Abandoned Land. But after these 2 years of debate, congressmen from both parties and in both houses still objected to a Department of Freedmen and Abandoned Land on the grounds that the act, quote, discriminates against whites. And these congressmen instead favored a department that, quote, proposes to take in all refugees. So this formal name for the Freedmen's Bureau, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen's, and Abandoned Lands, we often overlook that formal name, but the refugees in this name, in this title, specifically refers to white refugees. And the inclusion of these about 500,000 loyal white refugees was key in winning Congress's support to found the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. For example, a Democratic senator from Maryland complained that supporters of the bill, quote, are so wedded to the Black race that they lose sight for the moment of what is due to the white race, end quote. So after these 2 years of debating whether or not there should be a government department that aided recently freed people, the bill was only passed once the provisions for white refugees were also included into the bill. And it was this bill that a lot of historians still call the Freedmen's Bureau bill. This is the bill that was finally passed in 1865. And I think this story can tell us a lot about what is going on in 1865 in the United States. But I think one of the things that really stood out to me is how the role of white refugees, their existence, and their role in leading Congress to found the Freedmen's Bureau, it really shows the significance in one of the ways that white refugees were so significant during the Civil War era. But it also led me to question why historians know so little about these white refugees, especially when you consider their vast numbers. Congress estimated that there were almost 500,000 of these people, about an equal number of freed people who became refugees. And you can also see through the Freedmen's Bureau just one of the ways that these white refugees helped to shape the reunited nation. So why do we know so little about them? My dissertation examines the experiences of these refugees who fled from the Confederacy under duress during the Civil War to seek refuge behind Union lines. My research considers what prompted these refugees to leave, as well as what logistics those people escaping from the Confederacy and resettling elsewhere had to navigate. And I also consider whether or not they ever returned to the South. And these questions are especially significant when you consider the absence of any formal institutions for the aid of refugees in the 19th century United States. The refugees I look at in my dissertation had diverse backgrounds and varying and really sometimes ambiguous motivations for leaving the Confederacy behind. But refugees from throughout the South scattered throughout the world as they fled from the war, fleeing to places ranging from New York to California, Indiana, Mexico, France, and even Sweden. And my dissertation follows these refugees from their decision to flee to their journey out of the Confederacy, their resettlement elsewhere during the Civil War, and I also consider their experiences in the post-war era. My dissertation joins a growing body of scholarship on mobility during the Civil War and on the Civil War refugee crisis. Millions of people were on the move during the Civil War. And in fact, one historian has recently argued that one of the most obvious features of daily life in the Confederacy was the movement of people, including Union soldiers, Confederate soldiers, deserters, escaped prisoners of war, enslaved people who were in bondage, as well as formerly enslaved people who had escaped from bondage, and the refugees that I look at in my dissertation. Much of the research on Civil War refugees in recent years has focused on the experiences of formerly enslaved refugees who fled to Union Army lines. For example, those in Dr. Taylor's award-winning book, Embattled Freedom. And my dissertation seeks to add to this growing scholarship on the Civil War refugee crisis by examining these 500,000 people who, although they were not enslaved, still fled from the Confederacy under duress during the Civil War. The handful of studies that exist on free people who became Civil War refugees all look inward, focusing on those who migrate within the Confederacy as it shrinks and becomes smaller and smaller. And the main goal of a lot of this scholarship is to understand more about the Confederate home front. But this insular focus of the refugee crisis obscures the movement of refugees who fled from the Confederacy to Union lines and beyond, while my focus on those who left the Confederacy exposes this crucial failure of the Confederacy to contain the very people it assumed would support its bid for independence. My research expands the geographic scope to those who left the Confederacy and also expands the discussion of the Civil War refugee crisis into the post-war years to consider the long-term effects of displacement on individuals and on their communities of origin, their host communities, and on the reunited nation as a whole. My research indicates that demonstrates that the Civil War refugee crisis had a national scope and national ramifications, and the expanded geographic and temporal boundaries of my research suggest that one of the most enduring legacies of the Confederacy was the movement of its people throughout the nation. So my dissertation explores the contours of the refugee crisis by examining both wartime experiences and the aftermath of displacement. And it's separated into two parts, one about wartime experiences and one about post-war experiences. The first part, wartime experiences, consists of 4 chapters, each focusing on a distinct group of wartime refugees who shared a similar migration pattern. They're leaving from similar places and going to similar places. For example, chapter 1 focuses on Native Northerners who fled from their Confederate residences to return to the Northeast. And this chapter emphasizes that unionism alone was not enough to prompt refugees to leave the Confederacy. Refugees dealt with a multitude of factors and logistics that shaped their decision and their ability to escape the South, including factors such as gender, location in the South, and the timing of their flight. And in fact, Northerners often relied on their pre-existing social connections to make their transition to a new life more smooth. Chapter 2 turns to Native Southerners who fled from the South by specifically analyzing the social networks of Quakers who fled North Carolina as conscientious objectors, and examines the communities that they developed and congregated in together as refugees. Chapter 3 moves further south by looking at the experiences of the thousands of Texans who fled into Mexico, paying special attention to the significance of the international border and the unpreparedness of the United States government to address the thousands of destitute refugees asking for aid at U.S. consulates in Mexico. And then finally, chapter 4 expands on the federal government's unpreparedness to address a refugee crisis by examining the experiences of the nearly 30,000 American Indian refugees who fled from Confederate-controlled Indian Territory to seek the protection of the United States government in Kansas. Part 2 of my dissertation, which follows the refugees into the aftermath of the war and highlights the long-term consequences of displacement on the refugees themselves and also on the nation. And this section has 3 chapters that distinguishes the experience of those who returned to the South from those who chose not to return to the South. I found that those who returned to the South did so because they believed they had a promising future in the South, and specifically in helping to reconstruct and reshape the region, which they did in 2 major ways. First, once many of these refugees learned or determined that it was safe for them to return to the South, and also realized that agencies like the Freedmen's Bureau could assist them in returning, these wartime refugees played key roles in rebuilding their communities, often through the building of schools and through the expansion of industrialization and mechanization in the South. And then second, wartime refugees had a really important influence on politics and Reconstruction in the South, mostly because wartime refugees could easily take oaths of allegiance and participate in politics, unlike former Confederates who became disfranchised immediately after the war. While initially many of these wartime refugees were Republicans, as they returned to the South, they were often afraid of being grouped together with freed people and becoming targets of violent attacks by groups like the Klan. And over the course of Reconstruction, wartime refugees increasingly abandoned the Republican Party and their allies and recently freed people, as they embraced and helped restore white supremacist government in the South. Wartime refugees who returned to the South played an important role, I argue, in shaping the new South, but those who did not return to the South also shaped the future of the reunited nation. Despite their own displacement during the war, refugees actively encouraged the displacement of American Indians in the West, as they became Indian agents, soldiers, surveyors, and thousands who became settlers on indigenous land and supported settler colonialism and early American imperialism in the West. I conclude my dissertation with a brief discussion of how the pervasiveness of the lost cause has obscured the vast scale of the Civil War refugee crisis. And the vast scope of the Civil War refugee crisis, both in scale and in lasting influence, prompts historians to recognize that for hundreds of thousands of people, the Civil War was characterized by displacement and movement, and that their movement as a result of the war had significant ramifications on the future of the reunited nation. When considered alongside growing scholarship on the Civil War refugee crisis and mobility during the Civil War, my dissertation prompts us to reconsider the Civil War as a migratory event.
Thank you so much, Steffi. And now we will move to the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century with Abby Stevens.
Yeah, so we're just skipping forward about 20 years this time. All right. So I sent out my second chapter, but I wanted to just give you guys kind of an overview of the thesis as a whole. I have finally decided on a title. It's Building Public Health in a Rural State, Strategies for Preventing Disease in Kentucky, 1883 to 1914. And a lot of my thesis revolves around some concepts that I've adapted from military usage. So this idea of hard power, which in military terms is kind of violence, enforcement, action. Here in a public health context, I'm using it to talk about the enforcement of vaccinations, quarantines, moving people to isolation hospitals, and then soft power, which I'm defining as written communications. So things like educational pamphlets, newspaper columns, public notices, and spoken communications, so teaching people in person, giving speeches about public health. And then I'm also working under these constraints. The Kentucky State Board of Health was constantly limited by the funding that it received from the legislature, as well as opposition from local governments, state legislators, and individual constituents. So my kind of main character here is he was the secretary of the Kentucky State Board of Health from 1883 to 1914. Joseph McCormick, who was born in Howard's Mill, Kentucky in 1847. He graduated from Miami Medical College of Cincinnati and practiced medicine and surgery in Atherton and Bowling Green before he was appointed to the Kentucky State Board of Health in 1879 by Governor Luke Blackburn. So the first chapter is Early Public Health Strategies, or Making Do on $2,500 per year, which in today's money, $2,500 is roughly $70,000. So that's not a lot of money for a public health agency that's trying to prevent disease in an entire state. So the Kentucky State Board of Health began in the late 19th century, which was
I'm assuming she'll just pop back on in a sec. Uh-oh.
Does somebody able to text her? Sometimes people, speaking from experience, you can't tell if you're stuck.
I can text her. I'll text her right now.
Just to check.
I think she just popped off.
Yeah, she might be trying to get back on.
Yeah.
Her system or something. There she is.
There she is.
about that. My internet has not been kind to me recently.
We understand.
Okay. All right, let's try again. Okay. So we're transitioning to a more scientific view of disease, and that's the context that the Kentucky State Board of Health is coming in with. So they were empowered by law to enforce public health regulations. Like I said, forced vaccinations, forced quarantines, very different from how we see today. McCormick at one point said that the Kentucky State Board of Health was empowered, had the power under law to do practically anything. It was just the matter of actually enforcing it. So they communicated with the public through the papers, through educational pamphlets. And so we have this kind of, these dual strategies of what the State Health Board was empowered to do in terms of force, but also this tension with trying to actually convince people to go along with it. So educating them about vaccination, about smallpox, about typhoid, diphtheria, and trying to get people to understand this so that they would go along with these regulations and not just have to be forced to do it. The State Board of Health confronted yellow fever in 1897. They used an inspection service on trains. So they would send public health inspectors to meet people, refugees fleeing from New Orleans, Mobile, Jackson, Tennessee, and try to make sure that those people were not carrying yellow fever. They didn't really have an idea at this point of how yellow fever was spread, but they would welcome people onto these trains. They wanted to have a safe and humane inspection service, and they would make sure that they got everybody's names and the locations of where they were traveling to in order to have kind of an early form of contact tracing. Now we see something pretty different with smallpox because smallpox was a contagious disease, and it entered Kentucky for the first time, not the first time, but the first time in the course of this study in 1897 through Middlesboro, Kentucky, which is at the border of Tennessee and Virginia. And it was first brought in by a Black miner who spread it to many of the other people in his mining community. And it took almost a month for white health authorities to find out, because this town was segregated, and by that point it was too late to stop the disease from spreading. This issue of segregation and the public health problems posed by that were further exacerbated by the fact that Middlesboro, Kentucky was completely broke. And at the same time, the State Board of Health did not have the money to address this. And so the people of Middlesboro contacted the Marine Hospital Service, which was really the only kind of national public health agency that they had at the time. This caused further problems of authority between state, local, and health authorities. So moving on to the second chapter, which is $5,000 for a new century. Sorry, I know I'm taking too much time for this. The Kentucky State Board of Health was in debt by the end of 1899, but in 1899, the Kentucky State Legislature finally raised their appropriation to $50,000 per year. So for the first 17 years of its existence, the KSBH only had 2,500. So by 1900, they were able to kind of take the field again and start actively addressing issues of preventing disease. Smallpox remained widespread in cities until 1907 and persisted in rural areas for several years beyond that. It was a lot harder to enforce vaccination in rural areas than it was in cities. In 1902, the State Board of Health contemplated quarantining Kentucky against Indiana for smallpox, which is a really interesting episode, and I'd love to talk more about that if anybody's interested. There was another outbreak of yellow fever in 1905, where the State Board of Health used similar strategies to the one in 1897, but now knew that the disease was spread by mosquitoes, so they had additional strategies of oiling ponds, making sure that windows were screened. And they increasingly used the soft power measures of pamphlets and lectures to educate the public about routine illnesses, such as consumption, typhoid fever, diphtheria, scarlet fever, cholera, and phantom and dysentery, which McCormick argued caused far more people to die every year than the kind of big name diseases like smallpox and cholera and yellow fever. So the final, so I wanted to go a little bit into this idea of opposition to the State Board of Health. So there was one issue called the Porter case with smallpox in 1902, where a banker named Luther R. Porter's daughter, Amelia, was removed to the pest house or isolation tent on suspicion of having smallpox. Judge Barker of Louisville ruled that the State Board of Health had the power to enforce isolation of patients, but newspapers said that if the father of this child had used a shotgun in defense of his home, no jury of fair-minded Kentuckians would have done anything with him. And I argue that newspapers took the Porters' side primarily because they were white and upper class, and their comments to the effect that they would not have cared if this had been a Black Kentuckian. There's another incident in Paducah, Kentucky with yellow fever, where the town wanted to institute a quarantine, but in this case, the KSBH raised the quarantine, deeming it worse than useless because quarantines really didn't have a lot of effect in the case of yellow fever. The city's business community was worried about loss of trade and other cities quarantining against them, and their response in this case, the mayor said that the State Board of Health could go to Hades with a special stress on the Hades. So the final chapter is vital legislation and the price of a $30,000 appropriation. The State Board of Health's appropriation was raised to $30,000 on January 1st, 1911, which allowed them to finally actually be able to approach this goal of preventing disease rather than just fighting it as it broke out. So they now had a vital statistics bureau, which had a systematic record of birth, sickness, and deaths, bacteriology, which had free diagnosis and testing of disease samples, as well as free rabies antitoxin, and sanitation, which allowed them to test waterways to identify pollution and disease. But even as they got this increased appropriation, the State Board of Health investigated McCormick, the legislature investigated McCormick and the Kentucky State Board of Health, alleging that McCormick was at the head of a political machine and had misspent the people's money. He was opposed by this particular representative, L.B. Harrington, from Madison County, and supported by many of his fellow doctors who said that he was an excellent secretary for the State Board of Health. After 6 weeks of investigation, he was exonerated, but the truth really remains unclear. It's pretty ambiguous. And I argue that if there was a machine, it was on the whole a good machine because it prevented disease in Kentucky on a really large scale in a way that hadn't been possible until the State Board of Health gained the money and the powers to prevent disease. So my conclusion is that the experience of the Kentucky State Board of Health demonstrates that while hard power measures can be expedient in protecting the public health, a sustainable public health infrastructure also requires adequate funding and effective communication to gain the cooperation of the public in order to prevent and contain disease. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. And finally, we will go to Jillian McCommons, who will take us to, still in the US, 1969 and 1971.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my overall dissertation project and then zoom into the chapter you received, and thanks in advance to anyone who had time to read that. So my dissertation is entitled The Black Appalachian Commission, Black Power Politics and the War on Poverty, and I've extended the timeline 1965 to 1975. And I came to this topic because I was interested in present day debates about what to call Black people in Appalachia, be it Black Appalachians, Afro-Latins. So I decided to think about what did they call themselves in an earlier period of time. And I came across Black Appalachian together, and I was curious about when those two words came together because they're both politically charged terms. So I was able to trace them back to the Black Appalachian Commission, which was founded in 1969. So my goal became, what was the commission? Who was involved? What were their goals? What did they try to accomplish? So the overall dissertation is really a history of that organization. And my main argument is that the Black Appalachian Commission harnessed the opening of the war on poverty to challenge racism. It pushed the Appalachian Regional Commission to adopt policies that addressed racial inequality. Using ideologies rooted in their experience as Black and Appalachian, the BAC, the Black Appalachian Commission, developed a list of demands. They insisted the ARC increase Black representation on staff, allocate a percentage of federal funds to Black child care programs, and adopt affirmative action policies requiring white labor unions to open up to Black membership. Their radical vision of anti-poverty was to address it through anti-racism. While some white organizations in Appalachia rejected the intervention of the ARC, the Appalachian Regional Commission, centering the Black history of the region shows that the BAC worked with federal agencies by attempting to push them to a broader view of anti-poverty, a view that directly met the needs of the poorest Appalachians. In doing so, the BAC continued a long tradition of Black activists seeking federal intervention to solve or at least mitigate local manifestations of racism. So that's my overarching argument. And I try to get to that in the first two chapters kind of give a story of how did we get there? How did we get to this commission? What was it? How did we get to them then interacting with the ARC? So chapter 1 is entitled Black and Appalachian, Black Power and the Origins of the Black Appalachian Commission. That's from 1965 to 1969. And in that chapter, I talk about how it began. And it really began on the campus of Berea College in 1960s with Black Appalachian students agitating for Black power on the campus. They wanted to start a Black organization. They started a Black student union. And I'm arguing that that energy from that kind of Black organizing shifted into a regional context when those students attended an annual meeting of the Council of the Southern Mountains. So when they attended the meeting there in 1969, a meeting is kind of notorious in Appalachian studies for it being the meeting that kind of upends the council. It changes it. There's a contingent of poor people of various races who come in and say, we are taking over. We no longer want the council to be led by middle-class professionals. We want, as poor people, we want to represent ourselves. So this opening, they voted that everyone in attendance could vote and change the voting structure. And it was in this context that Black students from Berea College were able to propose a BAC. So this is the, here you see on the screen is a copy of the proposal. And just a quote that really stood out to me. In the past, the CSM has put most of its emphasis on the Appalachian white, omitting entirely the plight of the Appalachian Black. So this first chapter is really about, you know, where this commission comes from in the context of the Black Power era, the period of war on poverty, and what's going on in Appalachia at the time. Chapter 2 is a chapter I sent out, Campus to Community, the first 2 years of the commission. And here I'm trying to show what happens after they found this commission. What's the work they do once they return to Berea College, because they're still students, but they're headquartered on the campus, and so is the overall council. So now there's this new commission within the council that's specifically for Black Appalachians. This is the first time the council has this. So what I'm trying to show in this chapter is like this development over its first 2 years, and how the first task they take on as a commission is a research project. And there's a copy of it, a proposal for a summer project, research project in the problems of Black people. That's May 1969. So that develops into this report that's published by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And so what I go into in the papers that explain how these, you know, how this commission, this very small commission, started with a handful of people, how it goes over its first 2 years to then have a report published, and that this research project really develops into this report. And the report's significant because, you know, going back to that, the proposal, they talked about wanting to show the presence of Black people in Appalachia. And it was really important during this time to talk about numbers, to talk about the percentage of people. So this report did that. And it also shows, you know, the different organizations that became involved with the commission. So one of the things I talk about in the paper is how they use the numbers that they're able to find. So the census, the thing about Appalachia is very much a place, but also very much an idea. So the census, you know, they use the census and then would zone in on the 420 counties that made up Appalachia according to the ARC, and then would count the number of Black people in those places. And that's how they came up with this, these numbers that they printed on the back of their conference program. And this was really significant because what I'll talk about in the next chapters is how they use these numbers to then demand that the ARC give them certain percentages of funds directly to Black people in the region to use as they choose to use. So, and then that's the cover of the program pamphlet there, Met in Black Mountain. the further I get along in this research, issues of gender are coming up more and more. You'll see on the cover of this pamphlet, there's a picture of a man, but in later pamphlets, there's a picture of a woman added. So I talk about that a little bit in this paper, but I'd like to get into that more. And just to give you a sense of the chapters to come, the third chapter, I'm planning to really get into the relationship between the BAC and the ARC, because there's a whole paper trail of them asking for representation, asking for aid, and the ARC basically saying, we don't owe you anything. Who is this organization that keeps trying to, that's actually asking to be on our meetings? The fourth chapter is a case study really of what the BAC did in the region. They assisted a community of residents in Cumberland, Kentucky, who lost their homes during a disaster, 1972, a landslide. So the BAC goes there to support them in trying to get government intervention. And then chapter 5 looks at the BAC in Atlanta. By this time, they have an internship program. They're publishing articles, they're holding workshops. And so it's really kind of the heyday of the organization that eventually ends in 75. So I talk about that too. So that is my project.
All right, thank you so much, Jillian. And
do I need to stop sharing? Okay, there we go.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm just going to jump in here for a few minutes and see if we can get these papers and these projects into some kind of dialogue with one another, because ordinarily at a conference, that's the job of the commentator, is to come together, stitch the papers together, pull out the common themes, pitch some general questions to all the panelists that they can answer. But as you might expect, this was a little bit tricky for me when we're moving from the early medieval period to the 1960s, from Europe to Berea, from the early medieval Psalter manuscripts to the Black Appalachian Commission's report. But there's a way, so stick with me. I don't think it's very difficult to pull Abby's and Jillian's work together, not simply because of their common setting in Kentucky, but in the way in which they center our attention on responses to social problems, from epidemics of disease in Abby's work to racism and poverty in Jillian's. And I think here Steffi's work on the displacement of people in the Civil War also joins them in that respect. And together, all their work gets us thinking about organizations that tried to do something about these problems, tried to respond, and about the limits that these organizations faced. The State Board of Health, as Abby tells us in a very careful reconstruction of its work, ran up against all sorts of obstacles, including, among other things, public doubts about vaccines and about the power of a state board to enact quarantines or to send people to the pest house. I don't think this story is probably very surprising to anybody living in 2020. Big surprised, race-fueled assertions of individual freedom existed in tension with public health and the board's commitment to the general welfare. Meanwhile, the Black Appalachian Commission, as Jillian explains in her fascinating look at its first 2 years and how it evolved over time, first on the campus of Berea College, immediately ran up against the problem of funding, which we also heard about in Abby's work too. A problem that may be familiar to grassroots organizations, but one compounded by the unwillingness, the inability to some degree of the white organization, the Council of Southern Mountains, to lend a hand. And then there's the Freedmen's Bureau, as Steffi's important work shows elsewhere in her dissertation. From its beginning, ran up against what we might say are racial limits or the unwillingness of policymakers to fully fund, there's funding again, and support a federal social welfare program that only served newly freed people. And so they came up with this idea of creating a more race-neutral agency that would serve white refugees too. It's almost like the 19th century version of this all lives matter politics. So in all these papers, we see the enduring power of racism to structure social disparities in everything from income to treatment for disease. Now, it might seem like Mel's work on early medieval Psalter manuscripts is a bit distant in time and place to be in conversation with these other three, but I beg to differ. I think her exploration of the history of the senses, in this case, the way sound could be seen, which I have to say, I love the title, and I kind of, seeing sound, I just kind of stared at that for a while. It really made me think. I think her work is really an exploration of something so elemental to the human experience. How did the paratextual apparatus of notes and graphemes and illustrations inscribe sound on the page? How could the ears, in addition to the eyes, be stimulated by reading? These sorts of questions and the kind of general approach that Mel is taking here to these manuscripts made me wonder about how we might apply this to these modern US works. I mean, how are the questions born out of the particularities of early medieval history have the potential to really invigorate scholarship in the modern US? Well, consider that each of the projects, so we're thinking Jillian's, Abby's, and Steffi's here, also centers on a text, like Mel's does. In Jillian's, it is that crucially important report produced by the Black Appalachian Commission. In Abby's, it's maybe not just one text, but like a genre of text, the pamphlets. And in Steffi's, I'm a little too familiar with her work. It's a lot of different sources, but pick one. Maybe it's a Freedmen's Bureau report. All of you are working with texts too. And be assured, I'm really not trying to conflate all texts as just text. I mean, these are, we got to be good historians here. And of course, the Psalter manuscripts, this is a very different time and meaning than something like the Black Appalachian Report. But still, let's ask the questions. How do these texts look different when you shift your vantage point from the authors, which have been kind of the emphasis in your work, to the readers, as Mel is doing in her work? Can you see ways in which the form of the texts in your work, maybe its own paratextual apparatus, maybe there is one, maybe we can see something there. How might that have stimulated or prompted certain experiences in the readers of the texts in your work? Maybe they didn't stimulate the ears so much as other senses, or maybe there was something else to help readers read wisely, as Mel puts it. So in general, what might be gained by thinking more centrally about the reader's experience with a text? So maybe that's a little bit of a stretch here to pull things together, but I think that that's what we're here in a workshop like this to do, is to really kind of connect all our work and see how we might grow from one another. So throwing that question out there, which you all are welcome to address, but I'll just leave it kind of suspended for now. There's another question. This is a more conventional sort of question that I'll throw out to all of you, which I think also this workshop maybe provides a good environment to think about, because you are speaking to non-specialists. You're thinking, you're speaking, of course, well beyond your circle of academic history. And so I think all of you have done a great job today of communicating what your work is about to non-specialists. I mean, a really admirable job of doing that. But I want to see if you could take it one step further and tell us non-specialists what you see as the true significance of your work. What is the impact that it might have on your circle of academic history? Now, I think Steffi did this to some degree already because she presented her introduction, but maybe the rest of you could kind of take us more into your introductions and tell us a little bit more about kind of, I don't know, your hopes and dreams for this project. What impact do you hope that it has on people in your field? So I have some other little questions that we can chew on later, but I'll just leave it at that for now. And I see that Jillian has already raised her hand, so go for it, Jillian.
Well, I realized right after I stopped presenting that I forgot to read my arguments for each chapter. So I hope I hope that my project is coming through. It's clear, but I'm really trying to draw the two fields of Black studies and Appalachian studies together, because, and I think this is something that the BAC was trying to challenge by saying we're here, this region isn't entirely white. If you're going to talk about poverty, you have to talk about our experiences, our conditions, and those conditions are tied to racial discrimination, racial violence. So I think that I'm trying to look at that community to show that there is an intersection between Black studies, Appalachian studies, and the experience of Black Appalachians is a good place to start with that. I'm also trying to show how they advocated for themselves, how far they got with that advocacy in terms of being able to interact with national agencies, federal agencies. So my hope is that, I'll become a part of this growing field of Black Appalachian studies, which I think is recently grown, but also activism in Appalachia hasn't really discussed the role of Black people, and so then hasn't really discussed, racial dynamics, and definitely hasn't discussed. It's discussed class mobilization, but not a certain the levels of what's going on within a certain class. And I think that my research is kind of helping to, especially chapter 3 will help to try to get at, let's talk about working class people more and what's happening in this whole poverty debate. So I'm trying to get these two fields to talk to one another, but also center Black working class people.
Great, thank you. And we have looks like a list of hands here. So it looks like Jim is next and then Mel.
Why don't you let the speakers respond?
Mel and then Abby.
So that's a good question, Dr. Taylor. And I don't want to jump on Abby's good series of questions, Dr. Taylor. But thinking about the reader, I feel like Abby's chapter kind of did draw attention to the reader in some ways with, you mentioned that they use like the word sputum and expectorate, which may not have been familiar to people. And you're dealing with a culture of varying levels of literacy, right? Which I think there's some interesting parallels to the medieval world there as well. So I feel like, there's some ways that Abby is maybe thinking about that already. But then about your question about what kind of contributions I'm trying to make. I think one of the things that got me interested in this project in the first place was the way that sensory history provides access to the individual in a way, bringing the subject into focus, even in a society like the early Middle Ages where we don't have, we do have letter collections, but they're not biographical or, they don't kind of, you can't construct necessarily a biography of an ordinary person in the Middle Ages, or at least in my period. And so I think I was really interested in accessing the daily life of the monastery and using sound as a way to reconstruct that in some ways. And so I think it's kind of interacting with a long conversation in medieval history about the individual and the self. So that's kind of where I see it coming from.
Thank you. Abby.
Yeah, so Mel addressed a little bit of what I was going to say, but I kind of, it's maybe not as apparent from the presentation that I just gave, but a lot of my sources come from the State Board of Health. That's a lot of what I've been working from. And so I did try really hard to kind of look at how are people reacting to this, what's happening here. And one of those things is that these pamphlets are written, McCormick says that, or I assume it's McCormick, it's not entirely clear who wrote it, but we can probably assume it was him, says that they made an effort to write this in clear and plain language. And I'm kind of trying to point out that a lot of this language isn't stuff that's going to be familiar to the average Kentuckian. And more than that, literacy rates are, white Kentuckians have about a 10% illiteracy rate, and Black Kentuckians at this point, I think it was something like 27%. I'd have to look at the actual statistics. But when we're looking at the readers, what I'm saying is a lot of these people aren't readers. They don't necessarily have access to this. And so these public health campaigns, well-intentioned as they are, aren't necessarily reaching everybody. And more than that, they're not necessarily trying to reach everybody, because there's this kind of idea that you're attempting to reach the people who are leaders in the community, which is very much an elitist point of view, this idea that you can send knowledge to the top and it'll trickle down. And so I'm kind of trying to argue that that's not reaching everyone. In terms of what effect I'm hoping to have on the field, so a lot of public health discussion, historiography, is centered on the idea of public health as state building. And what I'm trying to do here is kind of focus even more on that and talk about state building, not just as the nation state, but as individual states. So I'm trying to apply this idea of public health on a state level. And not only that, but a lot of public health also addresses specifically cities like New York, San Francisco, Milwaukee. And I'm trying to kind of apply this idea of how do you make public health on a state level, and especially in a rural state like Kentucky, how do you address those issues of widespread populations who don't necessarily have as much access to education? How do you apply public health in those contexts, as well as in a more dense city-based context?
All right, thank you. And Jim, I think now it's your turn.
Thank you. In my leisurely retirement here, I have read both of the chapters that were sent us, and I found them very interesting. I have one little comment on each. For Abigail, not knowing the field, I was very struck. It was all primary sources. You mentioned Judith Levitt once, and I know there's going to be an introduction or a chapter 1 that does a historiography, but this is a problem I've seen with lots of dissertations, is once you get past that, then you just get all your primary sources together, and at least some reference to other things written, for example, about what is, when complaining about Tennessee and complaining about Indiana, is there any studies on those states and smallpox? And for Jillian's, trust yourself a little more. You had to tell me, or whatever new reader comes in, that the Council of the Southern Mountains and the BAC are based at Berea College about 4 times each. And, and it's all pretty much in the first 5 or 6 pages. So, you said it, you can move on and hope your readers are paying attention. And one question for Mel and one for Abby that is more substantive. For Mel, why are these Jewish Psalms so central, but the Jewish instruments are pictured, but nothing like them used in your monasteries? And for Abigail, I know in Europe, it's a stark contrast between Prussia and France over smallpox vaccinations, which are compulsory in Prussia from 1874, and are vigorously resisted by the Catholic Church in France. Is the Catholic Church in Kentucky and northern Kentucky or Louisville having anything to say, or is it only rural counties that are resisting? And Steffi seemed marvelous. I mean, the 4 different groups, I knew what your broad topic was, but I didn't realize quite how complex it was and how different those 4 chapters probably end up being.
I can answer first because I kind of, So this is something I get into a little bit more in this is a very, very small part of the chapter. But in the early Christian period, very, very, so the first centuries after Christ's death and resurrection, the Psalms were not the music of the church. They used their own original hymns, largely to, I mean, this is what scholars have argued, as a way to, distinguish the new Christian community from the Jewish community that they grew out of. That changes, particularly in the 4th century, and the rise of monasticism has been at times credited with leading to this movement to claiming the Psalms as Christian music and reading the Psalms as the word of David and therefore prophecy of Christ's incarnation and resurrection. This coincides with the rise of anti-Jewish rhetoric in some Christian doctrine as it relates to the instruments that were used in Jewish worship or in pagan worship, seeing them as being of the flesh and representative of the old covenant, and that vocal music is elevated, as Cassiodorus says, because it's produced from the kind of rational body, so it's coming out of the spirit rather than something coming from a piece of wood, which is and animal gut for forming the strings, which is very fleshly. And so that's why at least the theologians are saying there's no musical accompaniment. Something I have not looked into, they do so Pippin the Short supposedly brought a water organ to his court. And so there are early water organs in the Latin West in the 9th century. But everything I've read about psalmody, about chanting of the Psalms, suggests that they aren't accompanying the people when they're singing. So that's a kind of long answer to your question.
Other questions?
So Dr. Albacetti asked about the Catholic Church. As far as I'm aware, resistance was not church-based. It wasn't organized in that terms. From what I can see, it's more class-based. So I think I cover more of this in the first chapter. But people tend to not want to be vaccinated for a number of reasons. And one of them is that as I'm sure a lot of us have experienced with the COVID vaccine, the smallpox vaccine was pretty painful to get and could really knock your arm out of commission for up to 2 weeks, which was really a hardship for working class laborers who couldn't afford to miss that much work. There were also issues with, differences between the doctors, how they were trained to do it, as well as the dirtiness of the smallpox point. So some doctors would use the same smallpox point for 100 people, and people were not necessarily very happy with that. Also, they could be ineffective based on what kind of matter was used. So if you used matter from an infected person's arm, and then you, essentially, if you kept transferring that, they could become less effective. So people are often resisting based on these ideas of uncleanness as well as distrust for public health officials. As far as I'm aware, it wasn't church-based.
Well, I want to jump back to Jillian's paper. There was one element in your paper that made me sit up, because I can tell there's a really good story there, interesting story there about the student from Birmingham who hosts Fannie Lou Hamer, but then took classes from a professor or teacher who was pro-civil rights, but whose father was a Klansman in Birmingham. Did I get all that right, first of all? I have to say, I mean, I understand why you didn't delve into that story in a lot of depth, because it wasn't quite moving along the story of the chapter necessarily. But it is one that adds some really interesting, complex human dimension to it. So just kind of wanted to throw that out there for you. But I also had a question for you, which is, and if I missed this, I don't think I did, but so you do a great job of showing how the Black Appalachian Commission gets off the ground. Was it the first of its kind? Had there been attempts before? Or was there any other organization maybe trying to start somewhere else that didn't quite get off the ground or anything like that? Or is this really the beginning of it?
Okay, thank you for both of the question and the comment. I'll start with the first part. Ann Beard, she figures prominently in my first chapter because she is one of the founders of the Black Student Union, which Ed Smith and Homer Williams are founding members, and then they go on to found the BAC. And I talk a lot about her background in Birmingham and civil rights. And I interviewed her recently, and those parts I'm gonna go back and put them in, but she talks about arriving at Berea College and her and other Black students having to figure out, as Black people did nationally during this time, who they could trust to talk about certain movement things. And so apparently this professor, because he had been a member of certain organizations, had been deemed trustworthy, so they could work with him, and he was the advisor for the BSU. But she talked about how he had that history and that he would sometimes tell her details about the bombing at the Birmingham church where her father had been pastor at one time, and that they would talk about that. There are other instances in that first chapter where I talk about white socialist professors at Berea or in the community who connect with and help the Black Student Union in different ways. So there are a number of stories that I want to tell about what's going on in Berea, not just on the college campus, because they are connected. But she does figure prominently in that chapter and then kind of continues on. I do think that this was the first regional organization of its kind. I think that there are other organizations in Appalachia. There were NAACP chapters, there were National Urban League chapters. But I think that in terms of, because the council was a regional organization, there had been Black members of the council before who were active, like Almator King, who becomes a part of the BAC. She was in the council before. And there were other members who were there, but I think this is the first, which I'm arguing comes out of this kind of Black power push. This is the first time the commission has a Black commission. And they do eventually split because of some of, the things that they want to do that doesn't jive with the council, which itself is kind of starting to unravel at this point.
Jay.
Hi, everybody. Jillian, I just would love to follow up with you on your last point. I'm curious, would you say that that socialism or New Left politics provided the grounds for solidarity across difference? I mean, was that something that was the socialism only coming from the white faculty, or was there a shared sort of class or left politic commitment that helped make that trustworthiness or comradeship possible? And because I'm wearing this beret, I can ask that question today.
I do think that, and Ann Beard attests to this, she says that there were times, for instance, when Black students wanted to, and it was Black students and some white students that wanted to go to Selma, the March on Selma, to protest. And so they petitioned the college to give them official support in the form of funding, busing to get down there. And the college officially said no. So there's this important history. Yes, there's a New Left, but I think even before that, there's a civil rights history of the college, it has this reputation of being this interracial education, this kind of center of that, but there's resistance to supporting the civil rights movement. There's resistance to Black organizing. So I wouldn't say that it's the source. I think that it's kind of supportive, but for me, it's really important to center the activism of the Black students who start to call for Black coursework, who say we need to teach Black history, who are really trying to sound the alarms on their experience in Berea, and some of them having to carry weapons to feel safe. So I don't think it's necessarily coming down from these professors. I think it's more so that the students identify people that they can talk to and get some support from at the college, but they're still very much pushing the college overall to do so much more. I mean, there might have been one or two professors that they could go to in that way, but the college didn't have any Black professors at this point, which is another thing that the students were challenging and calling out. And they're saying, you have this tradition of interracial education, why don't you have Black faculty? So, yeah.
Thank you, Jillian. I do appreciate what you're saying about centering the activism of the Black students there. That makes perfect sense to me. Thanks for your answer.
I wanted to ask everybody, well, thank you for some really interesting presentations. And I really enjoyed the draft chapters, Jillian and Abby. Thank you so much for sharing them. This is really kind of more about thinking about the process of reading and thinking and writing about something really long and sustained, because that's something that we all need to do, and as working historians. And I'm kind of interested in what you've discovered about yourself, kind of as a thinker, over the course of your dissertating to date. For me, one of the things that was a big challenge, and probably remains my biggest challenge in developing a really sustained piece of work, is learning how to kind of zoom in and zoom out, to really do justice to the particularities, to the individual stories, and to draw back from that to sort of answer the broader so what question, and to try to do both those things simultaneously. And I find that to be kind of like a lifelong struggle. And so you don't need to be any more confessional than you want to be, but I don't think we talk enough about how hard this process is of what we do in trying to write something which at least has the potential to be book length. And there are so many challenges that we're confronted with. And I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit about what yours are and how you've been managing them so far, if you want to.
So I think one of the most difficult things for me during this dissertation writing, especially knowing that the topic I focus on is about refugees whose experiences have been so obscured, probably the hardest thing for me was when I had to cut some of them out. And I think like this is something that I've heard both professors and other grad students talk about before, is kind of that sense of guilt when you have this person with a really great story, but it's too much of a diversion. It doesn't really fit with your argument and your main focus for the chapter or for the dissertation as a whole. And kind of feeling, yeah, like you're kind of letting them down, even though in my case, at least, they've been dead for a while now. But that's also one thing I probably did with this dissertation a little bit more, hoping that it will become a monograph, was that, okay, well, I'm not going to cut them from the dissertation, but I know that person's not making it for, a monograph version, but they're going to make it into the dissertation version. So I think that I'm trying to balance some of these really great stories that you learn and you research and you learn about these people's lives, and then you have to, they don't make the cut. And then another thing for this dissertation, and I think probably for everybody who's presenting right now, is how the pandemic has also cut down on our ability to access some of the sources that we need to access, and just trying to figure out, what can I do to get around that? One of my chapters, I really wanted to talk more about how the Freedmen's Bureau specifically helped white refugees, but then the library is closed. And even though those records are on microfilm, I don't have a research library nearby that I have access to. So knowing that there are even more stories out there, that not even because of funding or that kind of thing, just because, the way the world's going right now, you can't learn those stories. And even if those might be better than some of the ones I do have, might be more relevant and more important for my argument, oh well.
So one thing that I've learned about myself, and Dr. Albacetti kind of pointed to this, is that I love primary sources. Primary sources are, the entire, not the entire, but a good portion of the reason I do this work. And I am not as disciplined about bringing in secondary sources. So that's something that I still have to work on. But the other thing, I've been trying through this whole process of writing this thesis, trying really hard to, the thesis is about this institution, the Kentucky State Board of Health, but also trying really hard to talk about its effects on individual people and the people who are responding to this, the people who are being affected by this. And the work that I'm doing kind of raises ethical issues that are happening today in terms of basically how do we deal with public health? How do we balance the individual versus the good of our society? And because of the sources that I've had access to, I don't know if there are more out there in archives, but I've really been trying to bring in issues of class and race, and it's been really hard to find the stories of individual people to address in that context. That's how it's been for the thesis. I'm hoping that we'll have more access to archives when it comes time to do a dissertation.
I went to go run and get how I've been getting through this. I went to and bought a dry erase board. So something I've learned about myself is that I really need to draw it out. So for each chapter, I've kind of been trying to do a visual map of where I want to go with things. And this really helps me. And then when I move to the next, I erase it, but I take pictures because it's kind of like an event to have it all mapped out. But I'm learning that I really need, to have those visual cues to where I want to go next, what story I'm trying to tell. And I am telling it in kind of a storytelling way, which to me helps people kind of enter the story a little bit more. So that's what I've learned.
I didn't raise my hand, but I think I have to agree with you, Dr. Harling. Something I have, particularly with the work on the Salters, because there's been a lot of scholarship on them, but I don't know if anyone's combined all of the kind of elements of the Salter apparatus together and called it that. And so I've had to resist the urge to, and I have failed at times. Dr. Fiery has read drafts where I failed, to, do so much detail work that there's no kind of argument or no, not fitting it into the other stuff that I'm working on. So I think, trying to balance this drive between, here's the stuff that I really want to detail, and okay, that's interesting, but it isn't what you need for this project, right? And trying to balance that has been something I'm still navigating.
But I think that's exactly what anybody at this stage in a project is grappling with. So I think I mean, especially during the dissertation process, but even maybe, you know, those of you who've written multiple books, Phil, I mean, I think that's just part of the evolution of a project. So, you know, understandable you're in that spot. Is there any, yeah.
I was just going to say through a glass darkly, right? Like it's always that way. Mm-hmm. And I think we're all, this is really hard work, what we've decided to do. And I think all of us struggle with it in our own ways, but I think there are commonalities among the ways we struggle with it. And I think it's good to share some of those vulnerabilities. Like for the longest time, I kind of resisted doing that. And so like my self-presentation was, you know, this is what I write and this is what it is. But I mean, it takes you so long to get to that point. And, you know, it's just good to acknowledge that this is kind of a perpetual struggle. And I think it gets easier to kind of sit with that struggle, but you always have it, right? Right. And before we go, I just wanted to commend all of you because a couple of you pointed out some of the unique difficulties you've been laboring under with the pandemic. And I just think it's heroic what you've been able to do, given these constraints, and we've all felt them, but for dissertators, this is just an incredibly challenging time. And, you know, I'm really proud of you guys for continuing on and presenting really interesting and polished work in a situation where there's a lot you don't have access to, and we're all hoping, you know, guardedly optimistic that that's going to change soon.
Yeah, on just this note, we have added a history workshop to discuss these issues about research during the pandemic, and that's going to be on Friday, May the 7th. And I believe we are still looking for panelist volunteers who'd be willing to talk about their research during the pandemic. So if any of you are interested in signing up for that, please let Amy or me or Dr. Mokros know. And I would be remiss in saying that we also have if we left without saying that we also have Elizabeth Catt, or is it Catte? I don't know how to pronounce her last name, who's speaking next week on being a public historian. And that is on April the 9th at 2:00 as usual. And I believe Claire Clark is going to introduce her and Melanie Goen is going to be the discussant.
Okay, well, I guess before we throw this back to Amy to conclude, Phil just said some of the things I was going to say to wrap up here, but that's okay. I actually, you know, what we do is hard, as you said. Sometimes presenting a work in progress is really hard, and being willing to put your work out there, whether it's in written form or just orally, it's not an easy thing to do. So I want to thank you all for being willing to share your work with us so that we can see some of the really amazing work that's going on in the department. And I would say that although you all have discussed how the pandemic has maybe held some of your work back and intruded, from what I saw and read, I see some really excellent, well-developed projects that you wouldn't know a pandemic had gotten in the way. So I just want to congratulate you all. And I know you're at various stages, but all getting close. Steffi's actually defending in a couple weeks, 3 weeks. So, you know, congratulations for getting this far. And again, thank you for being here today. So Amy, you want to take it?
Well, thank you again for all of your wonderful papers, your presentations. Dr. Taylor, thank you for your comments. And thank you for everybody that commented and for those wonderful comments. I think this is a fine example of how there's tons of us graduate students doing some kind of great work in the department, and we're all using different methodologies, but yet there is sometimes a central theme to what we're doing. And we are clearly over our time limit. So that's going to conclude us. And I want to echo what Dr. Patron said, that our next workshop will be on April 9th at 2 p.m. So until next time, have a great rest of the day and a good weekend.